Hi, welcome to another episode of the Lutheran History Podcast. Today, as a guest, we have Jonathan Wilson. I know Pastor Wilson from both serving on the Lutheran Historical Conference board together. He's done a lot of work that we'd find interesting today, especially in 2026 being the 250th anniversary of America. This episode is probably going to be the closest you're going to get to America 250th focus. He's going to talk about his research and his book entitled God on Three Sides, German Pietists at War in 18th Century America. A little bit broader than just the American Revolution era, but definitely kind of the main chunk of that content. So before we get any further, though, into this topic, I'll just ask, tell us who you are.
Thank you. Very glad to be here, Ben. I really appreciate this opportunity. I am an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. I am serving a congregation in rural northwestern Minnesota. I am married. I am the father of two, and we are a couple years away from being an empty nest. But I hold a PhD in historical studies. I've had that since 2015. And since 2016, I've been a member of the Lutheran Historical Conference. But it was when I was serving in the Chicago metro area around 2008 that I felt called into advanced studies. So I applied to the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago because it housed in its library many materials that were related to the Augustana Synod, which had overlapping institutional history with the Covenant. So LSTC was the Chicago area school to which I could commute while still serving a church as a pastor. And it was most likely going to supply me with the terminal degree in historical studies that could best serve my own covenant denomination. But as it turns out, my research concentration did not take me to the 19th century and the Augustana materials, but to an older inception of pietism in America.
Yeah, that seems to happen. I went in with one topic I was going to do for my PhD, and I'm not even in the same century anymore. So we find things, but that other topic will pop up again, I'm sure. So, and just for our listeners, you probably noticed we mostly have people who are Lutheran today speaking our Lutheran History podcast. But of course, we've had guests who've also had related backgrounds, and obviously the research area is the same. So, Pastor Wilson's going to speak to kind of his perspective, but most of all, his research on this Lutheran pietism in America today. So, that being said, you give us the background on your education. What led specifically to this book? What's its main kind of core concept or idea that you have throughout?
Yeah, so my journey began towards this book. It began when I learned that most of the German auxiliary regiments in the American Revolution, these are that group that many Americans refer to as Hessians, but these regiments were served by chaplains. The Brunswick Corps, which served in the Royalist campaign that ended with the Patriot victory at Saratoga, served a prince who was a Lutheran in religion. And most of its chaplains were trained at Helmstedt University. So speaking in, highly technical academic terms, Ben,
Hmm.
this blew my mind.
Yeah,
So
that's huge.
and here I had assumed that these German mercenaries were soldiers of fortune, that they were recruited from pubs and prisons. But no, these were conscripted units rented out to the King of England by treaty. And in the case of these Germans, the singing of hymns was part of unit discipline. None of that makes them pietists, of course, but were there pietists who connected in some way to that vast sweep of experience in the German auxiliaries? And I discovered that there were. The journals of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, as edited and translated by Theodore G. Tappert and John W. Doberstein, showed me these connections. Well, when you mix in the experience of German pietists in Muhlenberg's Pennsylvania Ministerium, some of whom enlisted in the American Revolutionary War, and then German culture Moravian pietists in America who were predominantly neutral during the war, but who had, for example, their town of Bethlehem in Pennsylvania taken over by the Continental Army because its dormitories served well as hospitals and prison barracks. Well, then you find that Germans with pietist associations were heavily involved in the American Revolution, and they were invested in its outcomes. And that brings me to the premise of the book, which is that the experience of German pietists at war in 18th century America disproves the assumption that people who believe the same way in religious faith can be assumed to vote the same way or even fight on the same side in partisan conflicts. I argue that other factors, such as economic interests or religional affinities, are more predictive of partisan alignment than is religious faith and expression. And that's the premise of the story. Of my book. It was published in 2019, and that was, well long in the first term of President Donald Trump. And of course, the buzz at the time had been that, evangelicals had supported Donald Trump. And I knew that that was very much a broad stroke statement and wondered if there was some nuance to that. And that was what I discovered.
Yeah, and I guess you pretty easily proved it just by naming names and showing what side they were on, right? Just to start with, look at these people sharing the same faith. Now, of course, the term pietist, there, at least among Lutherans, there wasn't a pietist synod of North America or anything, right? There's some nuance to the term. I've been in different circles, different conferences and classrooms where some of these individuals, even like Muhlenberg, is he pietist, not pietist? He's totally pietist, totally not. What does that term even mean? Sometimes it's only used in a negative way, sometimes only positive. There's nuance to it, but you're using the term as a common theme kind of throughout the whole book. So, just for the sake of our discussion today, so our listeners know how you're approaching it and what we're listening to, how are you defining pietist, and how does it have its place throughout this book?
Right. Thank you. I think those are some important distinctions to make. And the fact that I would bring along the Moravian experience in America alongside the experience of German Lutherans associated with the Pennsylvania Ministerium is itself pointing to that kind of nuance and those distinctions within under that broad umbrella. But one thing that is important for me to clarify is that the Evangelical Covenant in which I am ordained sees itself as carrying the torch of pietism today, or as former denominational president Gary Walter wrote in 2010, ours is a missional pietism in the Evangelical Covenant. So it is from that framework that I, for example, wholly embrace Henry M. Muhlenberg's orthodoxy as a Lutheran cleric, as well as his pietist allegiance to the directors of the Halle Institute. And this is clear enough from his own journals. For example, in volume one, with how he writes with appreciation regarding the ministry of George Whitefield, the revivalist preacher of the Great Awakening, and his appreciation for sober-minded and edifying conversation for which he produces verbatims. Then he will also speak about how pastors already in America who opposed him, some of them might have had uncertain credentials, but they tried to stripe themselves as belonging to the Orthodox and striping, Muhlenberg as this pietist from out of Halle and therefore someone of whom to be suspicious. But with that, I venture this definition now as one that is not only descriptive historically, but as also being self-descriptive. A pietist believes that one is justified by grace alone through faith. As Martin Luther himself wrote in his preface to Romans, Faith is a powerful thing which cannot help but do good works incessantly. So, by faith, not by merits, the Holy Spirit is effective in a changed life. And this harkens to the Lutheran pastor Johann Arndt, writing in the early 1600s in True Christianity. The fruits of this changed life become visible at some level, not because we are good, but because God is powerful. More specifically, the pietism that God on three sides is chiefly concerned with is that which emerged as a Lutheran renewal movement when the Lutheran superintendent in Frankfurt, Philip Jacob Spener, authored a preface for a re-edition of Arndt's True Christianity, which he called Pious Wishes or Pia Desideria, an English version also translated by Theodore G. Tappert in the 1960s. This pietism, which Spener advocated, was a back to the Bible movement. It was not intended to upend Lutheran orthodoxy, and certainly not to dissolve it. It was intended to revive spiritual life in the congregations. This is the pietism on which the Halle Institutes were established and which was formative on the life also of Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who became the patron of the Moravian pietistic revival movement.
Yes, and the whole topic, as we were discussing before this podcast recording started, is we probably could have a few more episodes just unpacking pietism. But thank you for sharing your perspective. Definitely, both those books, True Christianity, Pia Desideria, or something I was exposed to in college and read mostly in German classes or on
Mhm.
my own a little bit too. So they still have a place. Read a bit more critically, perhaps, the challenges usually talk about subjectivity or not a focus on doctrine, undermining the assurance of salvation. But you clearly are drawing that distinction between salvation by grace through faith alone. These works are separate, but what's being focused on, what's being looked for in Christian life, is going to be something pietism we'll bring into the discussion. So, but you've
Agreed.
clear now you've set up Hala, which I don't know if if you're just listening to this podcast, Hala actually hasn't come up that much yet. I know, shock and horror, but it's a major major institution, not just a university though, is it? It's a whole way of doing things. Not to catch you off script here, but could you tell us
Mhm.
just a little bit more about Hala itself, what it is?
Yeah, so it was established by August Hermann Franke, who was one of Spener's proteges, and was actually placed in the city of Halle on the Saale River, Halle an der Saale, in the kingdom of Brandenburg, Prussia. And Spener had put him there because there was an open pulpit, but also because there was an opportunity with the king in Prussia starting a new university and wanting then to have that faculty staffed by Lutheran pietists. And so, with the call the to the church in the suburb of Glaucha of Halle, then there was also a call to a chair in the theology faculty of the university. So Franca is then established in Halle and in Glauca. And while in Glauca, of course, in those days, the suburbs meant beyond the wall, and that was where you found poverty. And that was certainly the case. And so Franca was seeing, orphaned children, kids taken by war or by disease or abandonment, what have you. And he tried to find a way initially to minister to these orphans. And what began as a little school in the back of his own parsonage in a room with a couple bookshelves grew quickly into a an orphan's home And then from that, using the model of education where kids were organized by age group. This was one of the things that had come out relatively recently, and he was adopting that model. And the orphan school quickly gained a solid reputation throughout Germany and then throughout Europe as being a great place for sending your child to board and be educated. So while it was called the orphan school, there were probably about 200 orphans in a population of 2,000 students who otherwise the other 1,800 students were tuition pay. And so that was how those scholarships and the ability to provide education free for the orphans was possible. And then out of that, Franca develops a number of different vocational experiences, partly for apprenticeship for these students and partly to be able to market different things. So the Hala pharmaceuticals, medicines that we would cringe at today, but had a solid reputation, were developed on the grounds of the Hala Institutes. And then there was a publishing firm that got off the ground by publishing the Luther Bible, the Luther text, and distributing thousands upon thousands a year as that was getting going. And then as these things are happening, they develop breweries, and these kinds of things. And then along the way, they develop their own sort of post-secondary school for training missionaries. And so then they become a leader in subscription mission, the modern missionary movement, almost 100 years before William Carey leaves England for the Indies. That really Hala, with the patronage of the King of Denmark, began to do that kind of experience and sending missionaries to India themselves and then elsewhere. And it is their missionary journals that are translated in English, and the Wesley family is subscribing to these, and John and Charles Wesley, two of these numerous kids of the cleric Samuel Wesley, have these missionary stories read to them. And that is, part of their spiritual formation as the architects of the Methodist Church. So that's just an encapsulation of what August Hermann Franke got going in Hala, why it had the reputation it did, and why that became a platform for him to assert some clout of his own in the royal court and so on. And that, of course, led to its own kind of rivalry and envy. And so he was personally reviled at times, and the pietists that he trained were often reviled by those who saw what pietism was teaching regarding the soul's regeneration and so on as being dissolving of Lutheran orthodoxy. It is interesting, though, that as rationalism would appear later, that in fact pietists and Lutheran Orthodox would find a common cause against the emerging school of rationalism.
Yeah, thank you. And now that does kind of, I can just tie in quickly to the book we had a long time ago, great book called The German Awakening, which is now kind of the post wave of rationalist enlightenment, post French Revolution era, where you kind of see, well, the Orthodox and Pietists, they're both kind of in this together, but again, there are still differences. And a little aside too, it's interesting how I've seen how both Pietists and Orthodox, they blame each other for the rise of rationalism. They had their own narrative, their own argument. Well, that's because of this, that's because of that. So I find that fascinating. Again, a whole nother topic. But that Hala background, which you gave us, thank you for doing that, now sets us up to understand at least one of your main characters here coming from Hala, huge figure in American Lutheran history, hopefully some people at least already know a little bit about him, but I'd like you to introduce us first to Heinrich Melchior Muhlenberg. Why was he such an important figure? And now in your book, how did he attempt to navigate the revolution?
Yes, huge figure. There was a tremendous amount of work done in the middle of the 1900s to recover H.M. Muhlenberg's story for an Americanized English-speaking Lutheran church. Scholars like Tappert and Oberstein, already mentioned, and these were also involved at the same time with the Luther's Works translation. And then there was also Abdul Ross Wentz, and there were many others. And into the present day, and those I will omit in toto rather than embarrass myself by shouting out some names, but not others. But tremendous amount of work to recover Muhlenberg's story, to recover his writings, and he wrote copious amounts, leaving us a lot of documentary and discursive material. Clearly, in the mid 1900s, after two world wars featuring the nation of Germany as the hostile enemy power, there was a desire to establish Lutheranism as a birthright faith in the American context. That was the phrase that Wentz was using. And the scholarship of that time reflects that situation in Muhlenberg research. H.M. Muhlenberg was really the first successful organizer of a Lutheran synodal structure in North America that has institutions today that stand in its succession. Muhlenberg was supported by donations and by personnel, vetted at least in some fashion, by the pietistic Halle Institutes under the administrations of, by that time, August Hermann Francke's son, Gotthilf August Francke, and then after him, George Knapp, and then Gottlieb Anastasius Frelinghausen, who was in place through the American Revolutionary War. All of these were receiving correspondence and reports from Muhlenberg, as well as did their agents in London, F.M. Ziegenhagen, and then William Pasha. The connection there is through the Lutheran German kings, the Hanoverian dynasty that was invited to take power in England in the early 1700s, and with that continued and deepened the relationship with Halle Pietism. Now, Muhlenberg is important in the institutional story of the Lutheran Church as successor geographical synods that later formed the General Synod and the General Conference persisted through their successive mergers and then immigrant waves and assimilations and restructures into component parts of the ELCA today. Muhlenberg was the first author of model synodal constitutions and of articles of incorporation for local congregations. In many instances, he secured the legal footing of an existing church whose first trustees had not been staying abreast of the changes in property and in law and in structure. Those things, of course, have all evolved from Muhlenberg's time. But there are instances during the colonial period where a church might have dissolved or been absorbed by an establishment if it had not been for Muhlenberg's intervention. Now, in addition to all of that, Muhlenberg is extremely valuable as a primary source for his observations of early America and of the Revolutionary War. Now, he wanted nothing to do with it. War is for young men, and he was old. Muhlenberg was also confessional in his outlook and believed that his role as clergy ought to hold him aloof from all factions involved in civil strife. But to his chagrin, his own sons, by and large, put ministry in second place to the patriot cause. That they were patriots in sympathy was not so much his issue as that they deprioritized their own pastoral vocations. There is no doubt that they were fully committed patriots. On the argument that the apple cannot fall far from the tree, it is therefore concluded by some early non-critical historiographers that H.M. Muhlenberg must have been an ardent patriot himself. This was answered later by others who point to other statements and protestations in Muhlenberg's correspondence and in his journals, which suggest that he was actually a royalist in sympathies and that he was cowed into patriotism by circumstances. Well, some scholars have split the difference, and they see in Muhlenberg a neutral position shifting with the wind over the course of the war. But in that, some critics have concluded that these shifting allegiances meant that he lacked conviction. My argument is that Muhlenberg's sympathies are registered as early as 1764, when the Paxton Boys are riding eastward to confront the proprietary government of Pennsylvania for the need of a provincial defense in the western frontier counties. Euro-ethnic settlers, many of them German, were suffering from the Pontiac uprising. Critical historians now have an outlook that is much more sympathetic to the grievances of the sovereign Native American nations. But regardless, the violence on the frontier was horrific. The Paxton Boys had already exacted revenge against a peaceable Native American community that had been taken into protective custody. But those custodians had fled when the Paxton Boys militia got close and they were murdered. It was the intent of the Paxton Boys to do the same to the pacifistic Native Americans that had sought protection from settler reprisals in the city of Philadelphia itself. In all of that, Muhlenberg expresses sympathy with the white settlers and with the grievances of the Paxton Boys. His point of view is that the provincial government had a responsibility to exercise the power of the sword in the defense of its subjects. He found the Pennsylvania government, which was highly influenced by Quakers, to be derelict in that duty. That gives us insight into the convictions of Muhlenberg from that crisis all the way through the Revolution, his principles having to do with the power of the sword. His sympathy with the settlers during Pontiac's War may be viewed as sympathy also with the patriot cause in the Revolution, in terms of the patriot grievances that precipitated the conflict. However, Muhlenberg never embraced patriotism as a triumphalistic ideology. He critiqued its claims and predicted that divine judgments would come in their turn, particularly for the national sin of slavery. He expressed sardonic humor at best, rather than approval, on the vocational choices of his one son, the Patriot Brigadier General for the Patriot Army, and then his second son, the Assemblyman, who later served as America's first Speaker of the House. Then, in terms of what he owed to whom as a matter of respect and duty, that depended on the realities on the ground. His missions director in Halle, G.A. Frelinghuysen, wrote a letter to him that was to be circulated throughout the Pennsylvania ministerium, in which Frelinghuysen reminded all of them that as Lutheran pastors, they were not to mix their offices with other vocations or to choose partisanship during what he called the civil unrest. Because of the vicissitudes of war, it took that letter a year to reach Muhlenberg, and there had been a lot of developments on the ground in the meantime. Muhlenberg wrote back in a letter sent through loyalist German pietists in New York City, which then reached London and eventually back to Halle, in which he protested that neutrality was exactly what he was upholding, and that the sins of his sons in aligning with a partisan cause should not be charged to himself. Separately, he does wrestle through what his obligations are as clergy in a time of partisan conflict. Early in the war, he had insisted on praying for the king as part of the Lutheran liturgy, but he stopped doing that when the patriots held the city. He expounds his reasons with Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, as his foundation. The Apostle Paul's injunctions in that text only make sense if subjects and citizens are dutiful and law abiding to those who hold the effective power of the sword over them. To reject the effective power for some other claimant was to be in rebellion against that effective power. This is neither cowardice nor compromise on Muhlenberg's part. This is a principled application of his pastoral neutrality in a partisan civil war. And I just want to add a shout out to the scholar Samuel Zeisser, who had really gotten me thinking along these lines, although that was in relation to the Revolutionary War itself. And I'm tying back to the Paxton Boys. For these reasons, Muhlenberg credentialed a chaplain for a patriot regiment. His name was Christian Streit, and he presided at funerals for patriot soldiers. And in a way, Muhlenberg became a casualty of the war himself, as he stood too close to an honor guard when they fired their volley, and it damaged his ear. He was in pain for a long time and seems to have suffered permanent hearing loss from that point. That he wanted to retire away from the war in the town of Providence, now Trapp, is not itself an indication of any lack of convictions on his part. It is rather the awareness of his own infirmities in himself and in his wife as they advanced in years.
Well, thanks for that excellent summary. Fascinating just how he attempted to navigate that. I think one word that he used a lot in the book, which I appreciated, was his desire for being consistent. He wanted to take the Word of God seriously and how he applied it. And it's also understood in the Lutheran framework of two kingdoms or two realms, and there's a line there which, you touched on lightly in your introduction, and we can just kind of leave it at that. At that, we don't want to get into a modern political discussion, but yeah, that is still something churches wrestle with. At what point do I engage with partisan conflict, whether it's with words or with bullets, right? That's something that he was very conscientious about it appears throughout his application. So that's something we could appreciate the struggle the pressure he was under
And I
as he
think
was
that we can
navigating it.
learn from him as well, that his principled neutrality, may be something that the church and its pastors can look at in a time of heightened partisan tensions.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll talk more after the podcast recording's over. Those are always fun conversations too. But yeah, what does it look like to be a servant of the word in contrast to a servant of the sword? And you mentioned that too, kind of his view on that. But we got another case study, very interesting, and this is kind of what I think you alluded to earlier, what really piqued your interest, and something that was on my radar earlier as well. There are Lutheran chaplains on the other side in a very formal role where they're coming from. And you tell us that the case story of, oh, I wrote it down and now I forgot his first name, Friedrich Melsheimer, one of these Lutheran chaplains. So tell us your take on the transitions that he went through in his experience.
So this gentleman is also the subject of my dissertation, which was printed by ProQuest in 2000, 1915. F. V. Melsheimer became a colleague and friend later in his career with Gotthilf Henry Muhlenberg, and through him was welcomed into the American Philosophical Society. As a pioneering entomologist, he appeared then in the 1933 publication of the American Dictionary of Biography. Well, Melsheimer is absolutely obscure to us now, but he did publish in the United States, and he did serve with distinction in the Pennsylvania Ministerium for over 20 years in Hanover, Pennsylvania, with his wife Agnes Maria, with whom he had 10 children. There was a copy of his only run 1811 book, which in English we translate The Truth of the Christian Religion, which must have been rebound at least 3 times, and it was sitting on the stacks in general circulation at JCAM Library at LSTC. And this is before everything moved to the Catholic Theological Union, the present location. Well, to me, it was a precious thing, holding an artifact from 1811 of a pastor who had served with the German auxiliaries in the American Revolution. I think that is on the level of national treasure exciting. You know, the movies with Nicolas Cage, but most people just shrug. But I'm glad you find it interesting, Ben. Thank you.
We call those things relics, right? When it's like, oh,
Yes.
this, this is a tangible connection. Yeah. But
A
no,
tangible connection,
yeah.
indeed. Yes. Well, Melsheimer grew up in Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel. Braunschweig is the German original, and he matriculated in Helmstedt in 1768. Just after that, school doubled down on Lutheran orthodoxy and had published a new theology textbook by Johann Benedict Karpsoff IV. After graduating, Melsheimer took a fairly typical vocational pathway, serving as a tutor, and then he was recruited by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Baum to serve in the Dragoons Regiment of the Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel Army. The Dragoons were mounted infantry. By that time of his recruitment, they already knew that they were being deployed in the Americas. So Melsheimer then secured a publisher for his travel journals, which were published in Minden and which continued to be extant, along with translations made in the late 1800s. Now, in reading these, there is nothing about Melsheimer that strikes us as being particularly pastoral in his priorities or demeanor, much less either orthodox or pietistic. This is a young man in his mid-20s who sees himself as on an adventure. Compared to other chaplains of the German auxiliaries, like the Reformed chaplain G. Kester or the Lutheran Philip Waldeck, each of whom described doing ministry, for example, during the ocean crossing, or even of H. M. Muhlenberg himself, who described his seasickness on his Atlantic voyage, Melsheimer seems rather to boast about his sea legs, and he describes a burial at sea as an observer rather than as an officiant. His observations are extremely valuable, as in his journals he describes Quebec City and the solemn customs of the Huron nation, and the quaintness of the Quebec provincials, and his frustration at there not being any decent beer to be had. Then his second volume ends at the very point that Sir Guy Carleton has mustered his offensive down Lake Champlain in the fall of 1776. Now, that itself is not a very well-known episode outside of Revolutionary War enthusiasts. The most famous thing about it is that it featured a naval battle against a fleet that had been hastily constructed by Benedict Arnold, at that time still serving the Patriots with distinction and honor. But Melsheimer goes quiet on the outset of that campaign. That's where his second volume concludes. And we don't hear from him for about 3 years. Now, that narrative gap, fortunately, is filled in large part by Dragoons company surgeon Julian Vossmus, but we find nothing extant from Melsheimer's own hand until the spring of 1779. In the meantime, we know from Vossmus that Melsheimer had marched with the Brunswick Dragoons on Burgoyne's campaign the next year after Carleton's, that he conducted a Te Deum for the regiment at Burgoyne's command after the capture of Ticonderoga. Later in the campaign, he joined the Dragoons on their raid into what is now Vermont. He was captured at the Battle of Bennington in August of 1777. That was a Patriot victory, and his commanding officer and patron, Lieutenant Colonel Baum, was mortally wounded and died the morning after. Melsheimer himself was shot in the arm. Melsheimer was boarded with Surgeon Vossmus as the Brunswick Dragoons soon came under the conventions of Saratoga after Burgoyne surrendered his whole army in October of that year, 1777. Well, nearly 2 years after becoming a prisoner of war, Melsheimer and the Dragoons officers were billeted in the Moravian town of Bethlehem. Starting in April of 1779, he writes a series of 4 letters which are housed in the archives at the Moravian Seminary in Bethlehem. Melsheimer is seeking permission to marry Agnes Maria Mao, a woman he had met when she provided his laundry service. It seems that she had just left her parents' home for the single women's choir at the age of 18. So these are letters of introduction and of explanation as it becomes clear that despite leading an Easter Sunday service for the Dragoons officers with Etvine's permission, by the month of May, there is a falling out between Melsheimer and his, quote, brother officers. While in this correspondence, Melsheimer credits Helmstedt for teaching him strict orthodoxy, it is also clear from these letters that Melsheimer had the kind of crisis of conscience and of faith that August Hermann Francke associates with a personal awakening. These letters establish a personal testimony, a vivid, biblically anchored narrative that was completely absent from his travel journals of 3 years earlier. In one or the other campaign, either Carleton's or Burgoyne's, Melsheimer found his conscience unable to reconcile the demands on a soldier with the demands of Christ, especially as it concerned plundering the countryside. This is the testimony that establishes him as a regenerated believer, thus one that director Johann Etvine can in good conscience allow to marry one of the Moravian community and take her from them. His journey into the Pennsylvania ministry is helped along by its superintendent of that year, Christian Helmut, who puts him in touch with the congregation in Lebanon. Melsheimer was officially registered as a deserter of his regiment, and he was allowed to leave Bethlehem as a free man. He had switched sides from royalist opponent to a Moravian-style neutrality, and he was welcomed into the pulpits of Pennsylvania's Halle-sponsored German Lutherans. His status as a deserter did present a problem for his official enrollment with the ministerium until 1785, which was after all those royalist regiments had sailed back for Europe. And that was when Melsheimer was received with approbation in the Pennsylvania ministerium.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I think I had maybe one early English translation of maybe it was just the first two journals or whatever, as you were mentioning. So I only got kind of half the story or even less of it, so to speak. And, I remember reading it and saying, well, that wasn't all that exciting because it's just another guy on a boat, like you said, on a boat trip. Where's the Lutheran chaplain I want to see as far as my interest is? But yeah, this is, I don't know how rare it is, but to have a kind of this documentation of a personal religious, at least self-awareness or awakening, what other people may term it, but a maturity, very least, in his spiritual faith. But didn't quite join the Moravian group, though. He married one of them, it seems, right? And then remained a Lutheran, but kind of now brought into the Halle orbit of doing things. Thanks for listening to the first half of this interview with Jonathan Wilson about his book, God on Three Sides. We covered two case studies, one of Henrik Melchior Muhlenberg, and the other one of Friedrich Melsheimer. Next time we'll talk about Muhlenberg's son, Peter, who took a quite different path throughout the American Revolution, as well as a loyalist Lutheran pastor who ended up being a chaplain in the British Army at the end of the war. This podcast has been made possible in part by regular contributions from Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, MJ Hinman, Noah and Abby Broyles, Steve Zank, Rosa, Scott Henrich, Jeremy Correll, Deborah Hilger, and Mikhail Langer. If you'd like to become a regular contributor to the Lutheran History Podcast, you can do so directly on our Buzzsprout website or through Patreon.